call it giver's glow, call it give and glow. I'm not sure exactly what the best language game is, but boy, it's a universal truth. You know, I like to sometimes mention my very Irish mother named Molly McGee. Now that's pretty Irish. And when I was a little boy growing up around age 5 or 6, sometimes, you know, I'd have a sort of a boring blue afternoon, and my mother, with her kitchen table wisdom, would always say, "Stevie, why don't you go out and do something for someone?" And I would. We lived on a little street called Oak Neck Lane, and I'd go out and help old Mr. Muller rake leaves across the street, or Bobby Lawrence work on his boat by the creek. And it always seemed to me self-evident that one of the ways that we can feel best about ourselves is by contributing in small ways to the lives of the people around us. By the way, my mother, who was very Irish, married my father, who was very English. And so the humor around the table was always something along these lines. Marguerite, what's the Irish definition of hospitality? My mother would draw a blank and my dad would say something like, "You make someone feel perfectly at home while you be a-wishing they were." And then my mother would have a rejoinder, "Henry, why shouldn't an Irishman tell an Englishman a joke on a Saturday night?" And my father would say, "I have no idea, Molly." And she'd say, "He might crack up laughing in church the next day," and such things. So this was back and forth. It was just life at the table, you know. But I think my mother's kitchen table wisdom was just pretty much a perennial truth. And so there's nothing new about this, obviously, but sometimes it's important to repeat ideas that have a lasting significance. One of my favorite passages from the wisdom literature is this one: "Those who refresh others will themselves be refreshed." You know, it's not that we help others because somehow we're at heart basely self-interested, but as an unintended byproduct of generous behavior, typically we do experience joy, we do experience greater health, and even on average, although with exceptions, because obviously bad things happen to good people, but on average, we live even longer lives. Now that may sound pretty far-fetched, but I want to try to make the case for that. You know, Abraham Lincoln is such an interesting figure. A book came out recently called Lincoln's Melancholy. Melancholy is the old word for depression, if you will. He apparently had severe depression throughout most of his life. And there are remarkable stories about Lincoln, for example, walking out of the White House unescorted, and he was already 6'4", and he's got a big top hat on, so he would be unmistakable. He would go down to Union Station in Washington, D.C., and just arbitrarily look for travelers, in one case a young 13 or 14-year-old girl, and help them put their big luggage pieces on the train. He was constantly doing these general actions of helping activity. And he's famously quoted for saying, "When I do good, I feel good. When I do bad, I feel bad." He was coping with his own affective disorder, if you will, through small acts of kindness. And then, of course, you know, Thoreau, goodness is the only investment that never fails, or Emerson saying that anyone who sincerely helps another is also helping self. This is just such a part of a good life and of common understanding. So in the Hidden Gifts of Helping, I tell a little story about coming home from a meeting in Manhattan one night late on the Long Island Railroad. It's a very distinctive railroad. I won't go into why, but it's a real New Yorker's nightmare in a way. There was a fellow on my train, just on my car, just one person named Jack. And it turns out that his wife had divorced him. He had lost his job. He had cancer, and he spent down through his 401k retirement account. And I asked him how he was coping with all this. Well, he was going to Port Jefferson, the next town down the line from Stony Brook, and he was going to spend the Christmas holidays at a Presbyterian church just serving soup to homeless people. And he said, despite all of his peaks and valleys in life, the one thing that now gave him a sense of significance and gratification and purpose in life was to help others. So I thought that was really quite compelling. Another character in the book, who I met just 2 years ago, Brooke Ellison, had an accident as a little girl. She was 11. She became quadriplegic. She's the first quadriplegic to ever graduate from Harvard University. She graced the cover of the New York Times giving the graduation address. She did a movie that Christopher Reeve produced called The Brooke Ellison Story. Just a world-class gal. She's now about 28. And how does she cope with living in a wheelchair? Well, she gets into a van with her wonderful mother, Jean, and she travels around to visit young girls and boys who have had accidents and who are now wheelchair bound and are trying to figure out, how can I possibly live my life in this chair? And she works with them. She gives them her heart and her soul, and she models this kind of huge adjustment to a whole new kind of life. And this is how Brooke engages others, but also in the process, she finds so much joy and so much delight. Or Elisa, who's my administrative assistant in my center, who has struggled in the past with cancer, what does she do to navigate all of this? Well, she knits hats and gloves and scarves for children who come to the cancer center and they feel a little cold often enough in these buildings. This is what she does. She helps others, and that's her therapy. So that's the kind of thing that I think is so common, and every one of us in this room could probably refer to a dozen friends we know who engage in this kind of activity, which I think is just a testament to how universal it is. I was really thrilled a year ago when the largest managed care organization in the U.S., United Healthcare, came out with a scientific national study based on data from 2009. So it turns out that 41% of people in America were actively volunteering in various organizations. Now, that's actually up a little bit from before the downturn, which is kind of intriguing, I think, that people are maybe coping with the economic difficulties by getting their minds off self and contributing meaningfully to the lives of others. So in this particular study, it turns out the average amount of volunteering per year is pretty limited. It's 100 hours a year, that's all, which comes out to, what, 2 hours a week. So this is low threshold volunteering. And then they ask people, well, okay, so how does this make you feel? 89% say that volunteering improves their sense of well-being. 73% say it lowers their stress levels. 92% it enriches their sense of purpose. And here, this is amazing, 68% indicate that it made me physically healthier. Now that's self-report, but actually in the field of healthcare research, self-report is taken very seriously and it's often amazingly accurate. So here it is, you know, people are doing unto others, and in the process, somewhat paradoxically, they're feeling better themselves. I like to say, and I think it's a truth in all great spiritual traditions, that in the giving of self lies the unsought discovery of a deeper self. Now, this resonates with an idea that really goes back about 15 or 20 years now, the Helper's High, where individuals go out and just for a couple of hours do something for others in a meaningful way. A little more than half of them feel a kind of euphoria. That's now associated with the release of endorphins from the brain, which elevate mood. That many of them feel calmer and less depressed. Actually, now that's associated with oxytocin, the compassion hormone. When we help others, we see a spiking in oxytocin in males and females. And interestingly, in the field of behavioral endocrinology, oxytocin is also very closely associated with feelings of tranquility or serenity or just inward peace, right? And so we're beginning to get a sense of what's going on here. Even the reduction of chronic aches and pains, and this has been duplicated a number of times. Again, that's due to endorphin release, which can blunt nerve endings and allow people to handle pain a little more easily. So the science on this is getting pretty interesting. About 5 years ago, I was invited to London. I gave testimony to a team of about 400 scientists, and this is called the Foresight Committee. These are the major researchers in epidemiology in England. And they were trying to figure out what makes people happy across urban areas, suburbs, rural areas throughout the UK. Now, how many in this room are happy? Raise your hands. Pretty good group. How many could be a little happier, depending on the day? Oh, okay. So, and notice I'm not asking you explicitly what makes you happy. I won't go there. We'll just do self-report, subjective happiness. It turns out that perhaps the single strongest indicator of whether a community would report happiness on the whole is the extent to which you have a rich texture of giving to neighbors and to communities. So Victor, a moment ago, so rightly mentioned Robert Putnam, Bowling Alone, and now his new book, American Grace. Just how important it is to happiness that we have community, but it's not just community to support us, community to have the opportunity to disinhibit these capacities for compassionate care. Very interesting stuff. Now you actually have national reports indicating just how important giving is to our happiness. Now, when you look at the way giving functions best, I've been running around hospitals in the U.S. for 4 or 5 years working with large departments of volunteerism, because many health centers now depend heavily on volunteers. They might have 400, 500, 600 volunteers that they have to organize and take care of. Well, it's really important that volunteers be doing something that they feel called to do. You don't want to put them in the wrong niche, if you will. It's also really crucial that volunteers be doing something that uses their strengths, because that gives them the sense that they're effective as agents making a change in the world. Actually, this is quite intriguing. There are some studies showing that people who have just generic compassion have little higher depression rates on average. The way to move beyond that is to find an activity focused on some particular needful constituency that you feel called toward, and using your strengths make a difference. It's that sense of active, successful agency in the world that seems to be so important. And it's also crucial, studies show, dealing with volunteers, whether they're older adults or adolescents, to pull them together, to celebrate, to share experiences. And final comment, this is not a linear sort of phenomenon where the more volunteering you do, the happier you feel, but rather it's curvilinear, so it's a threshold effect. You do a certain amount, scientists talk about a shift effect, and then you sort of have that benefit. But again, it's just not a matter of doing more and more and more. In fact, you can overdo it. So this is a woman I got to know. I knew for about 25 years, Dame Cicely Saunders. She won the Templeton Prize. She was knighted or damed in the UK. She founded the hospice movement. A lot of you are familiar with the hospice movement. She actually invented the term. A hospice was a place where travelers in Europe might spend the night in the medieval period. It was usually just a place to sleep. It might be attached to a convent or a monastery or what have you. And she used her analogical imagination. She said, dying is a journey. So she took the word hospice and she created the world's first hospice in London. It's called St. Christopher's. I'm not going to go into how great a woman she is, but in 1999 she came to MIT to a conference on empathy and altruism, and she gave the dinner speech. And I was just sitting there listening to it. She said, I'm 83 years old. I still go into St. Christopher's every morning. This is a very humble woman. I mean, she started the hospice movement in Canada, in the US. She trained everybody. She's just, she was great. She died several years ago. She said, I still go in, and every morning I change bedpans for half an hour or an hour. And she said, it's a menial task, but it's a spiritual discipline for me. And then I sit on the ends of beds and I just listen attentively to the stories of people who are dying. And I do that, she said, because I want them to know that they're worth listening to. And she said that one of the most important needs that people have is the need to feel that their lives are significant, that their lives don't rest on just some crazy cosmic mistake, but that there's a depth and a meaning to their life. And when you listen to people, they feel loved, she said. So attentive listening, presence, being undistracted, that was all for her a tremendously important expression of compassionate love. And Dame Cicely was so amazing. When I was around her, I always felt this combination of joy, and it wasn't just happiness. Happiness kind of comes and goes, and it's very dependent on external circumstances, and happiness researchers point to it as a disposition that has a genetic set point. But she had a joy, it was as though she had been through so much in her life. She found a kind of inner center through giving, and it just anchored her in a level of happiness that transcended happiness. And she was not just optimistic. I think, again, optimism is a set disposition. She was hopeful. She had this deep, fine-tuned, honed, developed sense of hope. It was really quite astonishing to be around her. Her inner freedom, her gratitude for the very opportunity to serve people who were dying. Dame Cicely was unbelievable. And she's just, again, another testimony to the power of giving in allowing us as human beings to truly flourish. If you look at a lot of these reports on where people find joy, typically it's first and foremost in contributing to the lives of others. I don't know much about the Canadian figures on this, but in 1936, American researchers at the University of Illinois first started following scientifically self-reported happiness. Just like I asked you before, are you happy? And we were a little happier in 1936 than we were 3 years ago before the downturn. That was the middle of the Depression. A third of individuals were still using outhouses, so you should go home and rip out your plumbing. No, don't do that. Don't do that. But my point is, life was simpler. People were a little happier. Now we have all this material wealth per capita, but depression and anxiety rates have gone up tenfold. So somehow all this affluenza, getting the $200 pair of designer jeans at Abercrombie and Fitch, is not making people any happier. And there's this remarkable study that came out fairly recently from the researchers at the NIH showing that if you take people off the streets, you sit them in a laboratory and you hook them up to an fMRI device that picks up areas of brain activity, you put a menu in their hands, and the menu lists things that they could contribute to, like the Dalai Lama Center. No. Your alma mater, your Alzheimer's Association, your synagogue, your church, your whatever it might be. And when people get a eureka moment, they check a box next to that line item on the menu, okay? And when they check the box, a part of their brain lights up that's called, technically, the mesolimbic pathway. And that's a very ancient part of the brain in the limbic system. It's the emotional part of the brain. It's the part of the brain that's associated with feelings of happiness and joy. And it's the part of the brain that doles out what we might call feel-good chemicals like dopamine, and even now researchers are saying serotonin. So the very thing that we use often enough to try to treat depression is actually naturally elicited by even thinking about doing a generous act in a laboratory condition, right? So this begins to give us a little bit of a portrait of human nature. I've been studying happiness over the years and trying to figure it all out, and not too successfully, but I do think that in the end, most of the literature points to happiness involving a sincere concern for others, a kind of grateful simplicity, an attitude of gratitude, if you will, and an ability to appreciate the simple things in life, the beauty of a sunset, the smell of burning fire, logs on a fire, simple things in life. Also, moral integrity is really important, and then a kind of nobility of purpose. I think if you look at it all collectively, studying all that literature, those are the four key features of being happiness, of being happy. So I have an example of happiness. I'll just mention this. One of my friends over the years, Sir John Templeton, who was a major philanthropist and investor, who died 3 years ago and had started the Templeton Foundation. He was so remarkable. His son Jack, a retired pediatric trauma surgeon, once told me that a farmer back in Tennessee, where Sir John came from originally, mentioned to Jack that his father, that John Marks, he was born old. And what the farmer meant by that was that Sir John, at a very young age, was always thinking deep thoughts about themes around creativity, gratitude, hopefulness, joy, spirituality, and that's really quite true. No one can put their finger on why exactly, although his mother received, I don't know if you're familiar with this, a magazine every month called The Daily Word. Have you ever heard of that, some of you? Which comes from Unity Church in Missouri, and it's basically affirmations. An attitude of gratitude brings blessings, and then you have a little paragraph on that. Sir John loved this stuff growing up from about the age of 12 or 13. And of course, it's reflected in the Templeton Foundation, which is devoted to the study of all these kinds of spiritual values. Simple guy. He never had a chauffeur. When I was down in Nassau once with him in about 1990, in Lyford Key, there's a roundabout, and he had his old Rolls Royce, which he drove himself, and he drove it against the traffic because that was the shortest way to get to his office building. And all the people knew, oh, that's Sir John. And they would just, drive off to the side of the roundabout. It was really hilarious. But just the simplest guy, the nicest guy you could ever imagine, very humble. And a good example of I think, a joyful man. And of course, he left all of his money, billions of dollars, to try to ensure that going forward, we would spend a lot of time not studying just deficit and disease, but really the greatest human spiritual assets. So that's Sir John. And I can tell you, about June of 2001, I was sitting in my office in the School of Medicine at Case Western Reserve in Cleveland, and I got amazing facts. Now, Sir John, at that time, was 88 years old, and he did not email. He just never got into emailing. but he faxed, and he faxed like crazy. No one could keep up with his faxes. So he sent me a fax, and he said, we need an institute that can study love, not romantic love, but the love that gets people down to New Orleans after Katrina, the love that makes good, competent doctors real healers, that kind of love. So I faxed him back, Sir John, great idea, what should we call it? He returned a fax. The Institute for Research on Unlimited Love. Now I had a moment of white male trepidation, because here I am, I'm in this big academic medical center, and I think, okay, I got to do something about this. So I faxed him back. I said, Sir John, maybe we should call it the Institute for Creative Altruism, because altruism is a little more sciencey sounding, but it's also dry and arid. And, we ought to be able to talk about love in the most powerful sense, and that resonates with these great spiritual traditions. So I should be okay with that, but I was a little nervous. Well, Sir John faxed back real quickly. No, I think unlimited love, $8.9 million. And I did what I think, Leonard, Harvey or a lot of you would have done, I have to thank Tony, by the way. Where's Tony? Tony for bringing me here. But I think Tony would have done this too. I faxed back, Sir John, I love that language. It jumps right off the page. And we were able to support, through competition, a whole lot of these studies that have looked at the benefits of giving. So, there you have it. And by the way, I must tell you, I was very happy writing out those checks with Sir John's money. So I'm sure my mesolimbic pathway was just in seventh heaven, right? And one of the studies that we funded has become very renowned. There's a research project that began on the West Coast at the University of California in Berkeley in the 1920s. And there they studied 300 preteens. And a preteen in this category is basically a 12-year-old. So researchers from Wellesley and other universities went back and looked at all this data set, and what they found out is that the 1/3 of these 12-year-olds who expressed an altruistic desire in life, I want to use my talents and my gifts to help humanity, I want to do something to contribute to the lives of others. These individuals, by the way, were followed every 10 years by teams of psychologists, so they were given tests, they were looked at medically, their medical records were reviewed. That 1/3 that had this kind of generous, compassionate attitude toward life, over the course of their lifetimes, their depression rates are significantly lower. They're much less susceptible to heart disease, diabetes, and asthma. And now, interestingly enough, they're in their mid to late 90s. And so 2/3 of the people who are alive come from the 1/3 of the 12-year-olds who had that kind of compassionate, altruistic attitude earlier in life. So this is really pretty amazing. And this book, in the course of a lifetime, came out with the University of California Press several years ago. So you can understand, I was happy just trying to, conjure up these projects and help to support them and be able to talk with Sir John about it all. This one's really interesting. This came from Stephanie Brown. You think about widows and widowers who have lost a loved one. Now, the 3 greatest stresses the psychiatric community says in life are the loss of a loved one, loss of a job, and loss of a community. Well, the thing that predicts getting through the bereavement and grief process when you lose a spouse of many years is whether you can report just, significant incidences of helping others in small ways. It makes a big difference. So actually, it's interesting, in New York there's a voluntary association of widows and widowers, and they asked me to do an annual presentation at their meeting. So I talked with them, and I brought up this particular study. And there was one guy in the back who said, in the tone of a New Yorker, I don't care what you say, I don't do nothing for nothing. Oh my goodness, Well, the point is, hey, you may not get some sort of tit-for-tat payback, you may not feel that somehow there's reciprocity involved, but so what? Because on the level of internal reward, you're getting a tremendous break. So I told them that, and it didn't do much good. Lots of studies on volunteering, and now, in fact, the recovery models for depression that are coming out from the National Institute for Mental Health in Bethesda, Maryland, indicate that pro-social behavior and helping others is a very important aspect of sustaining recovery. Really interesting study of MS patients who make just 15-minute compassionate phone calls to other people with MS, and if you follow them for 2 years, they have all these improvements, including lower depression. And this one I really like. I was involved in this, and it's one of the few things I've done that's made the New York Times science section. But this is AA. Everybody knows AA, right? You Alcoholics Anonymous, you know, started by Bill Wilson, or Bill W., and an alcoholic surgeon proctologist named Bob Smith from Akron General Hospital. So they're both alcoholics, and they get together in the lobby of the Mayflower Hotel in Akron in 1935. And you know, they figured something out. They figured out that they could never overcome their alcoholism if they didn't help other alcoholics. That's why an AA service is such a big piece of it. And the 12th step is to help other alcoholics specifically. But no one had ever studied this. So with Maria Pagano and some others, we got interested in it. And it turns out, here's the fact. People go dry at day 1, and then they're typically in detox for 4 to 6 weeks. And then you wonder, where are they 1 year later? Well, the people who have fulfilled the 12th step of helping other alcoholics, and in AA there are lots of different measures for that that have been developed. And these are people who may be the greeter at the door, they may sponsor another alcoholic into AA, they may visit alcoholics in prison or in detox, they may just be making the coffee or setting out the tables and chairs for the meeting and putting them back later on. But the ones who, at a significant degree, fulfill this 12th step of serving other alcoholics have a 40% recovery rate, which is amazing. If they do all the other parts of the 12th step, you know, do a moral inventory, make apologies, where appropriate, make amends, and so forth, they have a 22% recovery rate. So the bottom line is that you double the likelihood of recovering from alcoholism in a 1 year window if you help other alcoholics. That's astonishing and amazing and really important. I won't go on forever because there are so many interesting medical studies that one could cite, but suffice it to say that there's not much controversy that older adults who involve themselves in volunteering at low thresholds or in giving tend to live longer. That's why it's not just a matter of serving older adults with Meals on Wheels and so forth, but actually we need to be giving them opportunities, recommendations for involving themselves in service activities. In fact, in the Bay Area in San Francisco, we're now experimenting with a whole movement where geriatricians across the Bay Area are involving older adults in opportunities to help others, and it seems to be pretty effective. This little study gets to wound healing. So it turns out that people who are in hostile moods, hostile emotional moods, have slower wound healing than those who are in more positive emotional moods. And one of the most positive moods that seems to be good for healing, and this involves interleukin-6 and the whole cytokine system, are people who are heavily involved in giving. So, you know, here it is, the golden rule, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. You know, that's not the minimal version of the golden rule. Do not do unto others as you would not have them do unto you. That's not much. It means that I can come home from work one day and feel completely spiritually and morally justified because I didn't walk up behind some wanton stranger and just break their knee, you know? That's minimalism. But here, you know, we're really talking about using the imagination. How can I help other people? You know, it's great for other people, but it's also tremendously important for those who are givers themselves. When I think about the moral and spiritual life, I sometimes borrow the language of the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber. Basically said there are two ways to live in the world. There's I-it. I'm the center of the universe, and the planets revolve around me. I only relate to other people insofar as they contribute to my little agendas. If you're a psychiatrist, you call that narcissism. If you're a philosopher, you call it solipsism. If you're a theologian, you call it sin. Doesn't matter to me, you know. But then there's this emotional transformation. It's not just intellectual, but it's very emotional toward I, thou, toward discovery of the value of the other, a kind of reverence, a sense of awe and respect for the other. Respect coming from the word respectare, to look again, to look twice, to value other people as ends in themselves. When we make that transformation, and that's at the heart of Buddhism and Judaism and Christianity and Hinduism, it tends to be tremendously beneficial to us as agents in the world. For Buber, there's still an I, but it's a different kind of I. You know, the world is so harsh. I was speaking with Allison Granger Brown, Brown Granger. Is she here? Allison? Allison, hi. This afternoon. Sorry about that. and she was saying how important it is for people working in the prison system to carve out time, to make a very intentional effort to be kind and generous and not to give in to all of the kind of negative pressures that become cruel and callous. I do think that intentionality is really important, that we need all of us to take responsibility, no matter what our environment, to create that kind of space. Just tell you a little story here. It's just kind of an anecdote, but it's fun. Maybe 5 or 6 years ago, the dean of Harvard Medical School, Joe Martin, retired. He's a neurologist of great note. And he had done his residency as a young doctor under Joe Foley, another neurologist, a friend of mine. Joe is now 96. Joe Foley lives in Cleveland Heights. So Joe invited me to come to Harvard with him because Joe has macular degeneration and he can't get around very well. So we went to this retirement celebration for Joe Martin. And Joe Martin, the first thing he said was, "Joe Foley, stand up." And old Joe Foley stood up. And Joe Martin said, "The thing I'll never forget about you is that the first time we went into a patient's room and I was your student, first of all, you knocked, you paused, you walked in after you were invited in, you got down right to the eye level with the patient who had had a minor stroke, and you asked her name, expecting an answer even if one didn't come. And an answer did come, and then you asked her, 'Mrs. Johnson, is there anything I can do to make your stay in this hospital a little easier?' And she was able to blurt out, 'Yes, get me a big iced tea with lemon.' And Dr. Foley went out into the hallway and somehow he procured this iced tea. And that was the thing that Joe Martin remembered about him, you know, that he had manifested and demonstrated this kind of caring behavior in a way that was intentional, that he cultivated on a daily basis. So I'm just going to float through some final things here. The way we live our lives really affects people. We have studies now that a single abrupt interaction with a doctor in a hospital raises serum cortisol levels for 2 days in patients. That's not very good for healing. You know, what are the things that overwhelm this compassionate capacity that we have? Negative hierarchies. This is always a serious problem. The stress of life, the will to power, in-group, out-group tendencies, tit-for-tat thinking like that fellow who said, "I don't do nothing for nothing." So we need to be aware of these and self-aware of these. What are the sources of compassion? Well, you know, they're pretty varied. There's this innate, hardwired rescue impulse. You know, my dad was in the Navy in 1937, and they put him in charge of building the submarine net across New York Harbor, where the Verrazano Bridge is now. It wasn't there then. And one of the workers fell into the water in the winter. My dad jumped in, pulled the guy out, and I asked my dad many times, Dad, why'd you do that? And he said, well, I was in the Navy, and that's what we do. But it was really just an impulse kind of a thing. It wasn't full of compassion or depth. It was something that he was trained to do by habit and virtue. Some people, Nazi rescuers, were rescuers in the Nazi period who took German children into their homes, speak about a sense of a common humanity. That's more of a cognitive intellectual principle. Empathy and compassion is one of the key sources that scientists study now, and certainly that's what we would associate with the Dalai Lama. Meditation, for some people it's a kind of sense of alignment with a higher power. There are many sources of this way of living in the world, and I suppose that most of us combine them to some degree. Finally, just a picture, Stephanie, an Alzheimer's clown who goes into these special care units, and with a lot of beautiful tone of language and a certain kind of facial expression and the use of touch, she connects in a tender way with deeply forgetful individuals. And the Alzheimer's clown movement has been very successful at kind of bringing people out of themselves. And I was impressed. She actually sings with these individuals. There's a lot of neuroscience now pointing out that when you sing a song that a person will remember perhaps from their generational cohort, they typically can chime in for a few verses. Final point, a lot of us grew up thinking that Darwin was all about me versus you for some desired object in the environment that we're competing for. But the later Darwin, the Darwin who really became much more open to the importance of sympathy and altruism and compassion in our lives, he said that a lot of evolution occurs between groups, and groups do better when they have a lot of internal generosity, a lot of internal helping activity. Group A will outdo Group B because of that kind of development. And so from a Darwinian perspective, the idea that somehow compassion and care would be associated with joy, with oxytocin, with even better immune chemical strength, these kinds of things are perfectly plausible from a Darwinian point of view. And then finally, this is the book, The Hidden Gifts of Helping, and it's a little bit based on a collection of things I did with Oxford Press a few years ago, just 30 scientific articles by researchers around the country, all of them looking at this relationship between giving and health. So those are my comments, and I thank you for your time, and I think, Lynn, you wanted to have some conversation. It went really well.